nurture and develop emotional bonds. So let's start there. What does the research tell us?
Well, the research that struck me the most in this book, one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is pull together research from a lot of different places. So a lot of psychological research, but also connecting it with economics, with neuroscience, trying to understand what we know about how kids succeed, what sorts of environments, what sorts of connections, what sort of relationships, what sort of circumstances help kids do better. And one of the things that I think all scholars in all of these fields are finding is that when kids early on in life, especially in the first 12 or 18 months, have that close, attached, nurturing bond with a parent or another caregiver, what psychologists call a secure attachment, it helps them in all sorts of ways in the long term. You know, psychologists have known for quite a while, or believe for quite a while, that secure attachment is important. But it's only in recent years that we've been able to track people from birth all the way into young adulthood, and to see how that secure attachment bond in early childhood leads to more positive outcomes all the way through childhood and beyond.
Now, it is incredible that if you have those emotional bonds, it can mitigate trauma and poverty, which I found fascinating.
I did as well. So a lot of the book is focused on kids who grow up in low-income homes. And one of the things that we know often goes along with not having a lot of material resources is also stress. And it turns out, as we've learned more about the biology of stress in the last couple of decades, it turns out that stress is a very important mechanism for doing the kind of damage, having the kind of negative outcomes that growing up in poverty and adversity often has on kids. That when kids are growing up surrounded by stress and trauma, it makes it very difficult for them to develop healthy, robust stress response systems. And that has an effect on our physical health. You can look at adults in well into adulthood and see differences in how likely they are to have heart disease and cancer because of stress. It has an effect on our mental health, and it also has an effect on the development of a certain set of skills that matter a lot in school. And when kids are able, even if they are living with a lot of toxic stress, when they are able to form a close bond with a parent or another caregiver, that tends to act as a shield against a lot of that toxic stress. It makes it easier for kids to withstand that kind of difficulty. And so often when you meet people, and I do this a lot in my reporting, when you meet people who grew up in poverty and nonetheless went on to great success, you often find that one of the parts of their story, one of the key elements of their story, is that they had that close bond with a parent, sometimes with a grandparent, even with a foster parent, but there's always that one person who they had that connection with early on.
And that's so important, and that's something I talk about just about every day when I do this show. Now, there's some interesting research about rat pups, and in I guess it was Montreal, is that right? Really watching how moms or the mothers of these little baby rats responded to their pups and the amount of they licked them, and in fact over generations it mattered, and it affected how these pups grew up and in fact mothered again. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So you're right, it did have an impact over generations, but also had an impact on every just in the life of each pup as well. So this is a study that was done by a neuroscientist at McGill University named Michael Meany. And Meany had a whole lab full of lab rats. And he noticed that there was this one particular behavior that certain mother rats did. And he called it licking and grooming. And it wasn't, licking and grooming is not about, making your pups look better. It's about soothing them when they get stressed out. That certain mothers, when the pups would get stressed, they would lick them and groom them to calm them down. And Meany wanted to find out what the long-term effect of licking and grooming was. So he devised this experiment where he divided the mothers up into ones that did a lot of licking and grooming. He called them the high LG mother rats, and ones who didn't do much, he called them the low LG mother rats. And the mothers in this experiment just raised their pups for the first couple of weeks of life, and then the scientists separated the pups from their mothers, which is what happens with rats. They grew to adulthood, which is 3 months for rats, and then he gave these new adult rats all these different tests. And the rats who had experienced a lot of licking and grooming as infants did better on all kinds of tests. They were braver, they were more curious, they did better at mazes, they lived longer, they were healthier. He could actually see differences in the size and shape of certain parts of their brain, all this one behavior that their mothers did just in the first couple of weeks of others have speculated that there's a connection, there's a parallel between that licking and grooming and attachment-promoting behaviors in mothers. There's that same kind of long-term effect. It can often mean, be relatively small behaviors in the mother or the father, just creating that kind of security that's sort of soothing for an infant. But the effects that it has throughout the lifespan of either a rat or a human can be really profound.
It's incredible. So you move on in the book to really talk about some of the programs that are out there, and one of them has been increasing vocabulary for children. So I want to sort of transition to how do we change some of our programs, how we change the way moms or caregivers react or act around children, and develop more of this attachment behaviors that can really help long term. Are we actually doing this out there yet?
Yeah, so far in a pretty experimental way, but there is increasing evidence from I talk about 4 different studies from different parts of the country that are doing similar interventions, often with parents who are really troubled. That they select for these experiments parents sometimes who already have a history of abuse with an earlier child, foster parents who sometimes have more tendency to struggle with the kids that they're raising. And yet when they do these interventions with those parents, they find some really positive results, that in these experiments they go from just a few kids in a sample group having a secure attachment with a parent to 60% or more of them having that secure attachment. And the interventions often involve or are similar to this therapeutic process called child-parent psychotherapy, which was developed by a psychologist in San Francisco named Alicia Lieberman. There are different variations on this, but basically it's sort of a 2-generational therapeutic model, so that with varying degrees of intensity, a therapist or social worker or someone will work together with a parent and a child, helping to mitigate the effects of trauma, which have often affected the mother as well as the child, and helping to give the parent the kind of secure support that he or she needs in order to pass on that security and support to the infant.
This is so important, and I love all of the information in your book. I really want listeners to take this all in because it is so deeply important. And these attachment behaviors is sort of as the rat pups were licked and groomed as parents, when we can really connect emotionally with our children, it gives them the ability to go out in the world and feel secure. Now, you talked a little bit about skill sets. What kids need to be successful in school, and these skill sets really are sort of built upon this secure attachment. What are those exactly?
So I'd say the underlying idea, the main thesis of my book is that for the last couple of decades especially, we've been emphasizing the wrong skills and abilities in our kids. We've been focused much too much, both in education and in child development, on IQ, on that narrow band of cognitive skills that's measured on standardized tests. And the scientists and the educators who I'm writing about in this book have identified a different set of skills. Economists call them non-cognitive skills. Neuroscientists sometimes use the term executive functions. Educators call them character strengths. They include things like grit and curiosity, conscientiousness, optimism, self-control. And we're finding that they're highly predictive of all kinds of important outcomes, at least as important as IQ, and maybe more so, that when kids are able to develop these skills in childhood, they generally lead to really positive outcomes. And they tend to be things that I think in the past we've thought of as just innate temperamental qualities, just optimistic or not, conscientious or not, has that character or doesn't. But what we're finding is that in fact they're very much malleable skills, the teachable skills that they're formed by the environment in which kids grow up, and that there's lots that parents can do and teachers can do and other professionals can do to help kids develop them.
For example, grit, let's talk about that for a little bit. I think a friend of mine, I was talking to her about interviewing you today, and she said, well, she had heard about a study that Asian kids and Indian kids had been given a tough mathematical question. They would apply themselves for up to 8 minutes. American kids would give up after 30 seconds. What's going on here? How do we teach our kids grit? And what is grit exactly?
That's interesting. I've never heard of that study. So grit as a psychological category is the invention of this researcher, this one person, this researcher at Penn named Angela Duckworth. And she's psychologist, and she had been studying self-control, and there's lots of research, lots of data showing that self-control in kids when they're able, in this famous marshmallow experiment.
I love that one.
The lure of a marshmallow for a few minutes, they tend to do better even into adulthood. But what she felt was that self-control, while it's very important, it's also kind of limiting. Self-control is just about not doing things. It's about following other people's rules and resisting temptation and delaying gratification. And she felt like there was another skill that was more proactive, that was about going out there and accomplishing things. So she came up with this term grit, and for her it does involve a lot of self-discipline, but it also involves passion. She defines it as perseverance in pursuit of a passion. And so kids who have grit are the ones who have a clear goal, a clear dream, and don't let anything get in the way of that goal or dream. And it's a big question how to teach grit. We certainly know that kids can develop it, that they can get a lot better at it. Other words for grit are things like perseverance and stick-to-itiveness. We don't, however, have sort of a perfect curriculum that we can hand to parents or hand to teachers and say, here's how to make your kid gritty. A couple of things we do know. One is that it matters a lot how we praise kids.
Yes.
There's one of the sets of research that I talk about in this book is the research around mindset by the Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck. And she's found that when we praise our kids for their abilities, and we just use language that suggests that they're just somehow magically smart or good. When they get a good grade, we say, oh, you're so gifted, you're so brilliant, this is fantastic. That creates in them what Carol Dweck calls a fixed mindset, where they think that their abilities are just set in place, and they somehow luckily have got these skills. Whereas if we praise effort, if we say to kids, oh, you got a great grade on that test, that's fantastic, you must have worked really hard at that, then they associate doing well on things with working hard. And when they get a bad grade or when they fail at some task, they don't take it as this sort of existential threat to who they are. Instead, they take it as a sign that they haven't worked hard enough, and so they apply themselves more. And so that small action, how we praise our kids, what we tell them, what we convey to them about whether these characteristics are changeable or fixed in place, can, I think, have a huge impact on how gritty kids are and how likely they are to persevere.
I like that, and that's something for all of our listeners, and myself included. I'm a mom. I've got a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, and a 13-year-old stepdaughter, and a couple other stepkids who are older now. But yeah, praising their efforts rather than praising the actual product that they came up with is such an important thing, and I know I forget to do it. And the whole idea of developing grit and really starting out with a strong emotional bond as a foundation for parenting. Now, we're going to go to a commercial break in just a couple of minutes. I want our listeners to understand I'm absolutely thrilled to be on the phone with Paul Tough. He is the author of How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. Paul, you've been racing around the country. I guess this is the very end of your tour, your book tour, but you've talked to NPR and I think NBC. You've been everywhere in this book, and so many people have really sat up and taken notice. So this is terrific to be on the phone with you. We're going to, well, I guess we're not going to go to a commercial break quite yet. I'm getting this low down. But maybe just a couple words before we go to a commercial break, Paul, on this self-control piece, because I see that in my own kids, which is it's hard to really develop that.
So self-control, I think, is a really complicated one. That's one where we know the research is really clear, starting with the marshmallow test and continuing through some large-scale studies that have looked at how self-control in kids equates to positive outcomes later in childhood and in life. But it is still a challenge to figure out exactly how to develop self-control in our kids. So one thing that I don't think there are self-control worksheets that you can give a kid. Well, I think there are a couple things that we know that can help with self-control. One is attachment, so that when you create that sort of secure base for kids early on, again in the first year or two, that creates a kind of confidence in kids, and it makes it easier for them to exercise self-control. They don't feel this constant anxiety and feel like anything that I see that I want, I got to get it right away because I won't be around later on. And then the other is that
Paul, I've got to stop you there. We've got to go to our commercial break, but we're going to come back and talk more about this. We'll be right back, listeners, with Paul Tough.